Hello again. We are at the third panel of this conversation about how to build a trustworthy digital environment. And the following panel is going to be again about ethical issues and economical issues, but in a different perspective. So what can we do? What is important to think for us citizens to contribute to the digital trustworthy ecosystem? We have Gry Hasselbalch, senior key AI ethics expert at research lead in INTouchAI.eu, and I can go ahead with all these vowels and letters. And we have also Maria Savona, professor of applied economics at the Department of Economics at Lewis University, and also in Sussex, UK. So the European data strategy, the role of ethics, what can we do, what is important that we citizens know to live inside this world. Gry Hasselbalch.
Yes, thank you, Luca. It's the International Outreach Initiative for a Human-Centric Approach to AI, INTouchAI, which is an EU initiative, actually, that I am representing right now. And thank you for the invitation. I mean, there's so many details in the data strategy and the Data Act that we could discuss. We've heard about data intermediaries, data portability rights, the idea of data altruism, data contracts, interoperability of data, and all these things. But what I really want to talk about here is how we frame all of this in this context of it generate technological progress on a more general level. Because all of these details, they also, of course, correspond with some very overarching narratives about the different types of societies and the powers within them, just like we've heard the recent speakers talking about. And of course, we really need a more open conversation about this, and this is why events like these are really important. So we just heard in the last panel that there are different paths that we can take when it comes to the creation of these data infrastructures we're talking about, with different political anticipations and legislative implications. And these are, of course, right now competing at a regional and a global level to gain what some have called a technological momentum. Thomas P. Hughes, science and technology academic, once talked about these technological momentum, where we have local technological systems that are evolving into these bigger, more integrated global systems. So this is the same thing that is happening with our data systems, and which has actually been happening over the years, just without this conversation about the different interests invested in them and the power relations. And what's important to note here is that this is not just a competition between industries or regulatory powers, but actually it's also between different data science cultures among practitioners and scientists, and different expectations from citizens when it comes to data. And right now we are at this crossroads where we either look for common solutions or we move in different directions. It's basically in this way right now. But if we look at the history of technology, then it tends to evolve in terms of technology transfer, with one way of doing technology or one technological culture that eventually will prevail or dominate others. And this is, for example, if we look at the history, this is how our electric power systems evolved. This is how the World Wide Web evolved. This is also what happened with the most dominant commercial digital data infrastructures that we have right now, that are basically designed with this tracking by default mindset, which actually also has characterized very much the ethics, or sometimes I would even say lack of it, of handling big data in the research field. So when we speak about the European data strategy, I think it's important that we also talk about the power dynamics that it's reinforcing or creating. And really importantly also, what are the regimes of data powers it challenges? So how do our different data regimes distribute power between citizens, governments, industries, scientists, and many others? Who do they empower? Who do they disempower? And of course, as I keep repeating, we have to be really critically aware of these power dynamics to also understand what kind of powers we're promoting on a more global scale when proposing new strategies for developing our data infrastructures. Are we promoting the democratic powers that many speakers have talked about today, or monopolistic powers, totalitarian powers? Because this is what we're doing. We're creating and we're providing and we're distributing power by design. So basically, what we have to decide at this very moment, and I think we're also having some really good conversations about it, is a more global grand narrative about what role data technologies in society, what role should they play in society? How do we want them to guide innovation, investments, our policies, and our legislative proposals? And whose interest does these narratives that we're talking about serve? So which value system should actually dominate this global technological momentum? So this is, of course, also why I think that the European data strategy, it also needs to be more than just a European data strategy. Of course, we need a global value-based dialogue on data. And EU has a very particular position that has been developing over the last 10 years. We started with this very tough stance on data protection and the GDPR, where the EU was really positioned as this global regulatory superpower, as several people have talked about the Brussels effect. And then moving on to the work that we did in the high-level group on AI, on the human-centric approach, on trustworthy AI. Then we have the Data Governance Act and this more risk-based regulatory approach to AI in the AI Act. And the positive thing that I see right now is now that the EU is creating alliances globally with more like-minded partners, things like a human-centric standard for trustworthy AI, with initiatives like the initiative that I'm, for example, the key AI ethics expert for at the moment. EU can do the same thing, extending this type of technology diplomacy with data diplomacy. So what I'm also saying here is something that I think I've been saying this for many years since I wrote the book on data ethics as a competitive advantage for Europe in 2016, where we also described data trust and cooperatives and stores. This movement in Europe is that what I'm saying here is that the European data strategy has to be driven by interests that go beyond the creation of just a digital single market or EU as a leader in an efficient data-driven society. We need these endeavors to be propelled by this interest in preserving our democracies. We've seen how these data sharing infrastructures, for example, of social media that are driven by profit interest, how they tend to promote extreme content, so content with misinformation that works against democracy. And this is, of course, really a problem in this very moment where our democracies are really under a very violent attack. And this is, of course, also, we could think of it as a very dangerous subversion of powers through data. So while we're achieving all we dream that data can actually do for us, we need to be really reflective about the kind of societies we're creating, the infrastructures of powers that these technologies are developing and supporting. And of course, I'm dreaming about, like everyone else, I think that I have been speaking so far, about democratic infrastructures of power, serving the interests of democracies, empowering citizens. But this is, of course, not a certainty. We need to guide and defend that narrative on a more global scale. We need global diplomacy to facilitate convergence of regulatory approaches. We need to create legal certainty to solve these conflicts of interest that we see very often in a more overarching framework that ensures that these data infrastructures empowers our democracies, our democratic processes. Yes, and on that note, I'll leave it to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Gri. Yes, that's sort of the goal. And it seems to me that giving the floor to Maria Savona, an economist, what you say means that the market is not enough to decide what is the right path for digital ecosystems. So it's quite a long time that the market is insufficient, that from the market comes monopolies or something like oligopolies. But in terms of data, this is particularly complex and difficult. How Maria Savona will help us understand this?
Thank you, Luca, and thanks, Gray, for the great speech. I think we're very much aligned. Despite, as an economist, I always get invited to do the devil's advocate in some context, and I think this is one of it. My premise is that Europe is a benchmark, and I agree very much with you that it should be, probably exported to some extent to create a more leveling play field for what concerns data. So you were talking about power, and I think as an economist, I think what we should be reasoning also is in terms of value. And I think my reflection so far, a bit abstracted probably, is to get to the backbone of what is value creation in data. And I think in this context, I will just get to the backbone of what I think is the policy conundrum here around data and power structure that you mentioned. I'm relating this to value. My point, for example, within the European framework, firms can actually have ownership rights on databases, and this is something that has been recognized since a long time, since before the era of big data. So before data became such a source of value extraction. Whereas for individuals, there is more, like for data generators and data subject, there is more of passive protection. So Europe is at the great top of protecting privacy, but probably a bit less in terms of giving active rights and agency and control on data. We are obviously in a very right direction with the latest Data Act and Data Governance Act. I think there is still, however, a little bit of imbalance between different subjects. So the point is trying to understand how to create incentives to share data when it comes to social and public value of data analytics. And I think a little bit more reflection would be needed in terms of this conundrum between recognizing property rights on database for firms and creating incentives to share for individuals. This is something that is probably requires some reflections. I think also that there is probably we need to reflect on the changing nature of value along the value chain of data, what I call the value chain of data. So the data subject is inherently protected, the privacy is protected, and the raw data generation is inherently a public good, I guess. Whereas when data generated by individuals are collected and stored and analyzed, this becomes private to some extent value. So ideally, there is this power asymmetry if we reconduct this to value generation. Now, for what concerns, let me just get to the European Data Governance Act. So I'm trying to assess, or if you want, I'm trying to read the Data Governance Act as something specifically. It's a great step ahead, and I think it's something that we again, in which Europe is providing a benchmark. However, I would like to share some reflections on it related to what I was talking about the issues between individual data generation and other type of infrastructure appropriation of value from this data generation. So first of all, the backbone of this Data Governance Act is increasing trust in data intermediaries. You mentioned that earlier, and I think the issue here is how to create incentives to share when there is probably less trust than is expected to be when you want to improve sharing mechanisms. So there is a lot of emphasis on sharing on altruistic grounds, which was already in general incorporated in the GDPR. So there's something that probably is emphasizing this. However, I think that there is still a little bit of ambiguity when it comes to, attributing to the individual absolute rights such as privacy, at the same time not giving any relative rights or not giving, or less so, I would say, to rights to delegate to the data intermediaries that are becoming so central in this regulatory framework. So, for example, to me, it still remains some unresolved issues in the if we try to project the effect of scenarios of the Data Governance Act. The way I see it as an economist is a way to create a market for data, so trying to mitigate the sort of market failure of the absence of data markets. So here, what we are probably will be witnessing as a result of the DGA is probably a market of data intermediaries that are absolutely not for profit, as far as I read this regulation, with the aim of increasing trust in these intermediaries and ideally increasing data sharing for altruistic grounds. My question in this context are the following: is that, so what are the incentives of these actors, of these market actors, even though are supposed to be not for profit, what are the incentives created with the aim of increasing trust? And in terms of scale, if we think about this in terms of a market, which is what is going to be if citizens are, if data intermediaries are competing for citizens sharing their data, then what is supposed to be the minimum scale when it comes to data altruism to make sure that the benefits of sharing are there? So, for example, for health and research, we need a massive scale of data analytics and a massive scale of data collection. And therefore, we risk of having actors like big data trust that are competing with big tech in terms of dimension. At the opposite of the reasoning here, what is the safe? So therefore, there is the safe maximum scale that we are allowing for this data intermediaries to make sure that we don't that this doesn't become like a sort of market concentrated in a few actors. So ideally, these are questions that probably would need to be reflected upon when it comes to what are the results of the DGA. Similarly, I see this as probably individuals or citizens that are trying to delegate rights to data intermediaries. So ideally, we need to understand what kind of nature these are going to be and what is their sort of even their own governance. I think there is not a single, so there is not a dyadic way of citizens and data intermediaries. Ideally, we would probably need to rethink the sort of governance structure that is going to be needed to make sure that these intermediaries are effectively representing different interests and different rights of different group of citizens. And in this context, I'm really looking forward to see what would be the sort of scenarios that the EU sectoral data space is going to create in this context. I reiterate, so in a context in which the main purpose is to increase trust and to increase data sharing for data altruism and increase social value of data analytics, it's probably these kind of questions are of some relevance. So I'm looking forward to the debate. Thanks, Luca.
Thank you, Maria. So many questions and subjects to develop on. One could be the following, and you could both answer in your opinion. Let's look at the perspective 5-10 years of development of these things, let's say 5 maybe, and what will drive the development? It will be rational incentives, as Maria was mentioning. Will it be more about convincing citizens and companies to behave? Maybe by having a discussion on ethics, or maybe having a discussion on fear of what can happen if we don't do the right thing. Will it be rational or emotional debate? Agree?
I think we'll have a combination of both. Of course, right now right now we're dealing with an infrastructure that is somehow upside down in terms of empowerment of citizens and users, and that's what there's been several, the last couple of years, or at least the last 10 years, we've had so many revelations of misuse of data and things like this. So of course the debate has increasingly become much more emotional. And that is, I think it's a healthy debate. I think in order to gain an environment that is based on trust, then it has several aspects. It has a technological side, it has a kind of emotional side, if you want to call it that, and it also has a legal side. So we have a combination of factors that will create these environments. So if we somehow manage to create infrastructures that can show, for example, citizens that can provide them enough trust to be able to share the data that can then give them the benefits that they will see the benefits of using these infrastructures, then I think we're far. I don't know if that answers your question, Luca.
I don't know either, but it was a difficult question. What about Maria?
Well, to clarify, Luca, what I was trying to say is that I think it's welcome that the main thrust of the Data Governance Act is very welcome. What I was trying to highlight is that what's going to become of these data intermediaries if we put a lot of emphasis in this. I mean, it's good to have these intermediate layers of governance in between individuals and large infrastructure and large tech. And I think this is welcome. The point is that what do we expect from these actors? And I think we need a little bit of rational thinking in terms of what kind of scenarios of this supposed newly created market of data spaces, or whatever you want to call it, is gonna bring to this ecosystem. And I very much emotionally hope that we will have a higher level of trust. But I also believe that to have higher level of trust, you need to empower the individual with something a bit more than actually the right to be of their privacy to be protected. That's all.
Yeah, that's clear, and this is very important that we balance the different points of view and rights we're talking about. But one question from the audience is the following. While developing a European way to ethics on AI and data, we are distributing power by design. We should carefully reflect about the kind of society we want to foster for our own future? Gri, this is even a more complex question than mine. What do you think?
Well, that was basically what I was saying before. So I think it's really important that we consider. I mean, we've been very focused on this idea of values and principles, and I think we've been less aware and and we're starting to be more aware about basically what we're talking about here is a power battle. So it's extended into the design of our technologies, but also generally when we're talking about things like data intermediaries, then the way I look at it is that this is the kind of the counteraction to other kinds of regimes of power where there's been a concentration of power within technology and the organization of technology that is now being countered by other kinds of infrastructures or actors that can supplement and make a more fair data infrastructure. So in that sense, I think I understand I really see all the kind of implications that Maria, that you have been kind of presenting and questioning. But I think that, the first step is the idea of a data intermediary, to think of it as a counter to these kind of power imbalances that we've seen so far.
Maria, one more question before we leave the panel. Who will be, in your opinion, the leading actor in creating these intermediaries? Will it be technologically led, financially led, social innovation? Who will do the intermediary?
Well, I'm hoping not financially led, because if the whole thrust of this is, as I said, to create incentives to share and to give data subjects this sort of agency and control over their data, it means that you need to trust these intermediaries. So I very much hope that these intermediaries, this is the kind of ambiguity that I was trying to highlight, and there's a lot of emphasis of these data intermediaries. And as I said, as an intermediate, as Gri was saying, between large concentrated infrastructure and firms and the individual, these are welcome, except that we need to understand how to frame and regulate them before they might become exactly the same actors if we want to avoid to boil down to the same scenarios. That's what I'm saying. And in this context, I think that the main ingredient for this to be happening is that these data intermediaries should be having themselves a governance structure that is representative of different actors and different citizens groups, for instance. The same way we have representative unions of interest, that in the same way we should be having data intermediaries that are governed by something that is not representative of the interest of single people or single groups. I think that's probably the very basic ingredients that we need to incorporate in this context.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. And of course, again, it would be fantastic to go ahead with this chat, but we go towards the next and final panel, which is about decision-making and trustworthy AI. And we will see it in a minute.